At the age of 33, I reached a pivotal moment in my life. After 4 years of marriage to my husband, whom I initially met while we were both working at the same company, I decided to leave my job following our wedding, a common expectation in our rural community. Despite feeling constrained by this tradition, it played a significant role in my decision to quit. My former workplace was a small, provincial company with deeply traditional values that made it almost impossible for a married couple to work together, particularly under the prevailing belief that married women should not have full-time jobs. This cultural norm, combined with the company's outdated mindset, convinced me that continuing there was untenable. Subsequently, I started a new job where I was treated as little more than an intern despite my experience, while my husband continued in his original department. My duties were restricted to menial tasks such as making coffee, photocopying, and cleaning, tasks that, although not inherently demeaning, were assigned to me in what seemed a deliberate effort to sideline me. This was particularly frustrating as even actual trainees were not limited to such repetitive work. Attempts to discuss these issues with my husband were fruitless. It was difficult to tell if he was genuinely listening or merely avoiding the conversation, possibly fearing that my becoming a stay-at-home wife would compromise our financial independence. Then, one day, my mother called and suggested I talk to my cousin about my work frustrations, hoping he might offer some guidance or support. After discussing my challenges with various relatives and friends, my mother's efforts led my cousin to offer a helping hand. He knew of a job opening at a company where one of his classmates worked and felt my background would be a great fit. He encouraged me to apply, and I was thrilled to secure the position after going through the interview process. Excitedly, I shared the news with my family and friends, but my husband's reaction was surprisingly subdued. Despite his lack of enthusiasm, his silence on the matter allowed me to move forward and tender my resignation, which my then-employer accepted without delay. It seemed they had anticipated my departure. The farewell from my colleagues was laced with a polite yet hollow cheer, making me question the sincerity behind their words. "We'll miss you. Let's grab drinks sometime and feel free to reach out," they said, though I wondered who among them truly meant it. My new role was in a neighboring city, smaller than a major metropolis, but with a vibrant office district that offered an urban vibe. Joining this company was a breath of fresh air. The workplace culture was strikingly modern, there was no age or gender bias, and it boasted a diverse team, including international staff. This company practiced equality across the board, offering fair pay regardless of marital status. Impressively, my salary saw a significant increase, bringing me to earn nearly $12,000 more annually than my husband, a change likely due to the company's strict policies against gender discrimination. Here, men and women were paid equally for equivalent work, reflecting a true commitment to fairness and equity in the workplace. I haven't yet told my husband about my new job and the significant salary increase because I anticipate he might struggle to accept this change, given his personality and the conventional attitudes at my previous workplace. Despite these concerns, my job dissatisfaction has completely disappeared, and I find myself genuinely fulfilled in my new role. However, life at home presents its challenges. My husband does not contribute to household chores, leaving all the domestic responsibilities to me. This balance, or lack thereof, between full-time work and managing the housework alone is incredibly taxing. My workdays start early and end late, yet my husband does not share in the household duties. Instead, he spends his days lounging and snacking, often leaving the house in a worse state than when I left it. When I come home, I'm immediately met with demands like, "I'm hungry, hurry up and make dinner," or requests for a bath or coffee, which are both tiring and frustrating to hear. I chose to work because I value professional fulfillment and independence, but this decision has led me to shoulder an unfair share of the domestic load. Reflecting on this, I realize I might have been influenced by outdated notions and expectations about marriage roles. Since we got married, my husband has often insisted he is right, frequently pointing out my supposed shortcomings. He would say things like, Work is tough because you lack the ability, or if you want to manage both work and home, you need to try harder. His critiques didn't stop there. He would add, if housework isn't going well, it's because you're inefficient. Get used to it and improve quickly. And since you chose to work, don't slack off on housework. These criticisms have become a constant refrain, making it clear that the traditional expectations deeply ingrained in rural areas are still influencing our lives. I am now confronted with the task of reevaluating these dynamics and figuring out how to address this imbalance in our home life. In more rural settings, it's quite typical for men to not engage in household duties, unlike in urban environments. Among the married women I knew, many managed all domestic chores on their own, with some also juggling childcare, caregiving, and even farming tasks. This backdrop influenced my husband's expectation that it was natural for me to assume all the domestic responsibilities. This notion was reinforced by our families. Both my mother and mother-in-law were stay-at-home moms, and many women from my husband's generation were either full-time housewives or part-time workers. Despite being a full-time employee, I had become somewhat desensitized to this imbalance, passively accepting my husband's expectations and continuing to manage all the household duties as he saw fit. Though my husband never explicitly asked me to quit my job, the pressure to maintain my career while also fulfilling all home responsibilities was immense. This led me to believe that since I was committed to my career, I couldn't let the domestic side slide. This routine continued even after I changed jobs, and I often came home to a sullen husband. I would hurriedly prepare his dinner, apologize for my late arrival, and then scramble to complete the housework, frequently having little time to eat my meal. However, a turning point came when my husband discovered my wage statement, accidentally left in a drawer. He was silent as he read it, and my attempts to brush it off by mentioning it was due to overtime or suggesting he might soon out-earn me had no impact. Following this incident, my husband's behavior shifted dramatically. He ignored me for days, refusing to speak or even acknowledge my presence. Attempts to engage with him were met with indifference, and eventually I resigned myself to this new silent routine. One evening, as I walked into the living room after a long day, my husband abruptly broke his silence with a shout, "I'm home! What time do you think it is?" At my current job, there's a flexible schedule where everyone must be present during core hours, but the exact times for arriving and leaving vary. Despite my efforts to start early and explain my situation to my boss, I sometimes didn't get home until after 10 p.m. I often relied on ready-made or frozen meals that simply needed reheating. Nonetheless, my husband would wait to eat until I served him, sharply criticizing, "You shouldn't slack off on housework. The only reason you can keep working is because I allow it." As I hurried to prepare dinner, his intimidation loomed over the entire exchange. "You're just going to skip cleaning and laundry and go to bed, making excuses that it's too late? You're coming home late on purpose to slack off," he accused. Even on nights when I arrived home late, I still managed to perform quieter household tasks, striving to maintain order. Despite my efforts, the results were never perfect, and I often felt that I deserved the harsh scolding I received. I blamed myself, accepting his criticism as justified. "Brenda, are you listening? Don't get too full of yourself just because you're working," he would continue. Apologetically, I responded, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work. I'll try not to take it for granted." At the time, I genuinely believed this, perhaps conditioned to think this way to manage my workload. To mitigate weekday overtime, I took on extra weekend shifts. Daily, I vacuumed and did laundry, trying my hardest to keep up with all the household chores. My efforts were a constant struggle to balance work and home life, always trying to meet the unyielding expectations set before me. A few months later, a moment of clarity struck me. Why was I bearing the brunt of all our household chores alone? This epiphany occurred one day at work when I noticed a colleague's lunchbox, which her husband had prepared for her, He also took on the cooking duties at their home. I was initially shocked by this arrangement, but my other colleagues seemed to view it as quite normal. They expressed envy and talked about how sharing household responsibilities was common when both partners were employed. I felt isolated in my situation, realizing that none of my colleagues were shouldering all the housework by themselves. Curious, I started asking relatives and friends about their domestic arrangements. To my astonishment, none of their spouses did as little around the house as mine. This spurred a significant change in me. I decided to stop doing his share of the chores. I no longer cleaned his room, did his laundry, or prepared meals for him. His complaints and yelling no longer affected me. I believed a healthy adult should be capable of managing their own basic needs. I left for work much earlier than he did and often returned late, so it seemed unfair that I should continue to manage all the household tasks long after he had gone to bed. Despite his rants about housework being a woman's job or a wife's duty, I chose to ignore him and focus on my well-being. One evening, as I calmly ate dinner, he exclaimed, "So now you think you're something special just because you're earning a bit more money?" before storming out of the house. Watching him leave, I felt a cold realization settle in my heart. His focus on money and the insults he threw at me made it clear that all my care and effort were for naught. I couldn't endure it any longer. The next day, he stopped coming home. I assumed he would reach out if he wanted to address any issues. I decided to let the situation be, only to discover that my husband had moved back in with his parents. Whenever he came back to collect his belongings, our interactions were brief and strained. During these encounters, he often resorted to verbal abuse and even physical aggression, pushing me on a few occasions. These moments should have been opportunities for us to mend our relationship, but they only underscored the futility of such hopes. I was open to reconciliation if he showed any readiness to compromise, but his actions spoke clearly of his unwillingness. Feeling resolute, I started to consider divorce more seriously. I first mentioned it casually to my mother during one of our regular chats. She was incredibly supportive, affirming that I had been patient enough and that deciding to divorce was overdue. Encouraged by her backing, I next approached my mother-in-law on a weekend when my husband was away. Although we weren't very close, she had always shown kindness and understanding. She was initially taken aback by my decision but promised her support. With these supportive conversations behind me, I visited a lawyer to begin the formal divorce proceedings. I presented various pieces of evidence of my husband's behavior, including a timeline of events, entries from my diary, photos of bruises from his physical aggression, and recordings of his verbal abuse. The lawyer noted that while it was a borderline case for domestic violence liability, the evidence was compelling enough to pursue. Opting for a clean break, I decided not to divide our assets, forgoing any claim to alimony in exchange. I rented a room close to my work and began packing my belongings. On a moving day, I confronted my husband one last time. He had been buying meals from the supermarket and returning home daily, as he didn't want to impose on his parents any longer. When I told him we needed to talk, he resorted to his usual silent treatment, but I was undeterred and stated clearly, "We're getting a divorce. I'm moving out now. Please contact my lawyer if you need to discuss anything." I left my lawyer's business card on the table, but he didn't even glance at it. It seemed he believed that by ignoring me, I would eventually come back begging for forgiveness. Without looking back, I left the house for good. Surprisingly, my husband continued to reach out after I left, sending messages that had nothing to do with our divorce, invitations to share a meal, suggestions for a drive, or casual shopping trips. When I ignored these overtures, he escalated to sending desperate emails, accusing me of stubbornness and claiming he was willing to forgive me if I returned and apologized. At the lawyer's office, he displayed a confident demeanor, seemingly expecting me to be the one in distress, possibly breaking down. With a smirk, he signed the divorce papers, treating the entire process as if it were just a routine procedure. I quickly collected the papers, half worried he might change his mind and destroy them, and submitted them to the courthouse that very day. Later, my lawyer informed me that my husband hadn't truly believed I would go through with the divorce. Once the reality set in, he began to demand alimony and a division of assets. However, communication ended shortly after that. I suspect my mother and mother-in-law might have intervened and reprimanded him, advising him to cease his demands. Even after the divorce was finalized, I continued to receive odd emails from my ex-husband. Choosing to move forward with my life, I ignored these messages, focusing instead on building a peaceful and independent future. One day, unexpectedly, I ran into my ex-husband while dining at a shopping center with some friends from school. He was there with his colleagues who happened to be former colleagues of mine as well, so I knew everyone in his group. The encounter made everyone visibly uncomfortable, but thankfully his colleagues managed to steer him away from our table. My friends, who had only met my ex-husband once before at our wedding, found his presence particularly disconcerting. "That's my recently separated ex-husband," I explained to them. "He's been following me around and it's been distressing." Upon hearing this, my friends felt compelled to act. As they walked by his table, they couldn't help but comment, "He's a stalker. That's terrible. So creepy." Already uneasy around women, my ex-husband quickly left the scene looking embarrassed. After that encounter, the delusional emails that he had been sending me stopped altogether. Since then, I've been enjoying a peaceful life, relishing the tranquility of my newfound independence.